As I mentioned to our Sunday school, fishermen were considered in Jesus' time incredibly brave, especially the fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. There are some current and modern reasons for that bravery, and part of it's just the way that the Sea of Galilee was. I think it's officially the shallowest freshwater body of water in the world. And it's surrounded by cliffs and mountains on all sides. And so just the nature of however weather works, when the wind comes blowing, especially over the Golan Heights and over the lake, and it's a very warm lake, some tremendously violent storms can occur, and very, very quickly. And so if you're a fisherman on this lake, it can be beautiful weather, and then suddenly, without warning, there can be massive waves. A few years ago, there was a massive storm that hit the city of Tiberias and went right into the center of town and did a lot of damage. There were 10-foot high waves out of this little body of water. So it was actually a very dangerous place to fish. And a lot of people saw fishermen as very brave. But there were also other deeper reasons and spiritual reasons why water made a lot of people in the ancient world very nervous. If you were a scholar of the ancient scriptures at that time, you would know that the chaos waters, out of which God formed the earth and formed the land, they were actually actively hostile to God. And some people believe that all of the monsters and creatures that God had subdued were put into the chaos waters. And it was a frightening place. There would have been people at this time that believed that God dwelled in the land and in the desert and in the forest, but God could not be found over the chaos waters. That was a place where God wasn't. There were terrifying creatures, and there was very little to separate you floating in your little boat from the underworld. So it was a frightening and terrifying place where you were alone, possibly even alone away from God. So one of the things that the New Testament does is it makes the powerful declaration that actually God has dominion over the waters. That's why we have Jesus walking on water, Jesus quelling the storm, Jesus inviting all of these fish into a net. The New Testament says really unconditionally that God is in the land and the sea, above the waters and below it. That's something that you don't have to worry about anymore. You don't have to worry about the sea inhabiting terrifying demons the Lord cannot defeat. But of course, nobody really believed that much in the time of Jesus. And so the fishermen were people who not only were unafraid of storms and losing their lives at sea, but they were also unafraid of deep darkness and monsters and demons. They were brave. And so Jesus chose, I think, more than half of his apostles were fishermen, because Jesus needed some brave apostles to preach his gospel. And of course, over the next several hundred years, Christians did a lot of things that everybody thought were extraordinarily brave. They were people who weren't afraid of death, who weren't afraid of evil spirits, who weren't afraid of dying, who weren't afraid of the emperor, who weren't afraid of the other gods. Christians were remarkably brave, and we are called to continue to be remarkably brave today. I wonder how often we think about when we think of what are the greatest attributes that a Christian is called to have in 2015. I wonder how many of us would put bravery high on that list. We would have love up there, and we had a lot of our young people saying kindness, generosity of spirit, faith. But it's fascinating that Jesus chose bravery among the chief virtues of his first apostles. It's possible, if we look at the gospel from a certain way, that almost everything Jesus is calling us to do requires us to be brave. We're living in a world that's filled with fear. We've discovered many decades ago that marketing products is really easy to do if you can first make that person afraid. Is your bad breath bad? You don't know. You should be terrified. You might be ostracized for your family and friends by Scope. You can go down the list. There are so many products that are marketed through fear. Politics is increasingly done through fear. If you don't vote for, it's not vote for so-and-so because they have the virtues of someone that we should call to be a leader. It's if you vote for so-and-so, the country will be in ruins. It's a very popular political line. So we're living in a society that is filled with fear, sometimes very unfounded, sometimes justly. But there are deeper virtues that we're called to as Christians that many people are even unaware that they're terrified of. For some people, coming to church can be a kind of bravery. Being in community, living among people who are close friends, people who are acquaintances, and people who are simply fellow travelers following Jesus. We're living in a world where a lot of people are increasingly becoming unfamiliar with what community feels like. Just coming to visit us on a Sunday for thousands of people in this city is a huge leap of faith and an incredibly brave thing to do, to be here on a Sunday morning. We're called to speak to every kind of person. We're called to visit people in hospitals. We're called to hear a lot of tragic stories. We'll encounter them if we're here long enough. Some people have lived extraordinarily lucky and blessed lives. Others of us have seen great sorrow. And we all know that stories can change our lives. But there are some incredibly tragic stories that we'll hear and we'll encounter, and we ourselves will tell if we're followers of Jesus. And I think we live in a world where deeply tragic, true stories are scary for most people living in the world. It's possible that that's why we sometimes fear people who are among our poorest. I think we might be terrified of forming a relationship with someone who has seen tragedy, perhaps seen violence, perhaps struggles with mental illness. That can be terrifying for us to form a bond, to form a friendship, to experience that story and that life with them. Because we all know, we all have those close friends who we made, and something awful happened, and we were drawn into their story, right? That happens to every one of us. One of our close friends or our family, something happens, and we're drawn in because we love them. And we're drawn into the story of tragedy, and it's hard. It's hard for us, and it's hard for them. And it's possible that many people in this world insulate themselves as best they can from tragedy, from poverty, from violence, from illness, from disease, from aging. I think people are terrified to hear some of these stories. And so we live in a society, perhaps, and perhaps sometimes we live our lives protecting ourselves from terrifying stories and instead living alone, isolated, away from the church, away from community, and perhaps away from God. We were called to do first and foremost, it seems, is to be brave. It's not to be unafraid. The disciples were constantly in a state of terror. The disciples are almost always afraid. But they were brave, and they were fishermen, and they stuck it out. And they followed Jesus even when things got enormously terrifying, up until the end. We're called to follow God into some places that are holy and blessed, and sometimes those places can be frightening. And that's often where the holy dwells. So I encourage all of us, including me, to be brave in following the footsteps of the apostles as we seek to follow Jesus. Amen.